All right, strap in, everyone, because we're about to take a deep dive into the psychology of persuasion. You know that stack of excerpts you sent us from Robert Cialdini's Influence? The Psychology of Persuasion.
Yeah, the book that's basically like the Bible on how we get tricked into saying yes.
Exactly. Well, it turns out there's a whole science to it. Cialdini spent 3 years, get this, undercover, embedded with all kinds of compliance professionals, salespeople, fundraisers, you name it, to learn their secrets.
And what did he find?
He discovered that these pros aren't using any sort of Jedi mind tricks or anything. They're tapping into these deep-seated psychological principles that drive our behavior.
And we're all susceptible to them.
Every single one of us, even if we don't realize it, which is kind of unsettling if you think about it.
But it is. But that's why it's so important to understand these principles.
Okay, so let's break it down. First up is this thing Cialdini calls click-whir. It's all about our automatic responses. Remember that time you saw a limited time offer online and you immediately hit buy now without even thinking?
Oh.
That's click-whir in action.
It's like a pre-programmed response. Like, think about a mother turkey responding to the cheap of her chicks.
Oh, okay.
We see a specific cue and bing, a certain behavior is triggered. Cialdini calls these fixed action patterns. And they're usually pretty efficient, you know? They save us mental energy.
But the problem is, right, that these shortcuts can be exploited. Take that Xerox machine experiment. Remember that one?
Remind me.
People would let someone cut in line to use the copier if they said, because I've made copies.
Oh, yeah. Even though it was a totally obvious reason.
Exactly. They automatically complied with the request just because the person said because.
So it didn't even matter what the actual reason was. It was just the word itself. Wow, that's scary.
It is scary. So the first step to resisting these tactics is just being aware of them.
Right. So next time you see that limited time offer flashing on your screen, take a breath before you hit that buy now button. Ask yourself, do I actually need this?
Okay, awareness is key. But what about when we feel obligated to say yes? We want to say no, but something's stopping us. That brings us to Cialdini's principle of reciprocation, the give and take and take.
This one's powerful because it taps into our deep-seated need to be fair. You know, we feel this obligation to repay favors or gifts.
Even if we didn't ask for them in the first place.
Especially then, when those high-end makeup counters lure you in with a free makeover, knowing you'll probably feel obligated to buy something.
Oh, so sneaky.
And it's not always about tangible gifts either. Remember what Cialdini found when he sent Christmas cards to a bunch of complete strangers?
Oh, what happened?
Tons of those strangers sent cards back just because he sent one first. It's amazing how powerful that urge is to maintain balance in our relationships, even with people we don't even know.
So you're telling me that, small favors can actually lead us to make big concessions later on?
Oh, absolutely. Cialdini even shared that crazy story from World War I about the German soldier who spared an enemy soldier's life.
Why? Because he gave him a cigarette or something.
He shared a piece of bread. Just imagine that a simple act of kindness in the middle of a war completely changed the course of these two men's lives.
Wow. It really makes you wonder how many times we've said yes to things just because we felt like we owed someone something.
Right. It makes you think, maybe we should all start keeping favor journals to track who's done what for us.
Uh-huh. A favor journal. I like that. It would definitely make us more aware of how this whole principle is playing out in our lives.
For sure. Remember that study where people bought twice as many raffle tickets from the guy who had given them, a tiny unexpected gift?
Oh, right. The Regan study. And the crazy thing is they didn't even ask for the gift.
Exactly. It was just a little can of Coke, but it created that sense of indebtedness.
Which brings us to the Hare Krishna Society and their interesting tactic of giving out flowers or books before asking for donations.
Oh, yeah. They were masters at the reciprocity game.
And it worked, too, didn't it? People felt obligated to give something back after receiving that unexpected gift.
It was incredibly effective. So the takeaway here is be mindful of those seemingly free gifts and favors. They might come with a hidden cost.
Okay, I'm officially paranoid now.
Haha, no, don't be paranoid. Just be aware.
All right, let's move on to a principle that's all about, perception, contrast. This one's about how our brains, perceive value based on comparisons.
Right. So something can seem better or worse depending on what it's compared to.
Okay, so give me an example.
Think about those real estate agents who might show you a few, fixer-uppers first before they show you the house they actually want you to buy.
Oh, sneaky. They're setting you up.
Exactly. By showing you something kind of crummy first, the target house seems that much better in comparison.
So it's all about shifting your frame of reference.
Precisely. And you see this everywhere. Clothing stores, car dealerships, you name it.
Cialdini even had that funny story, remember, about the letter from the parent of a college co-ed?
Oh, yeah. Where the daughter starts by describing how she had to jump out of her dorm window during a fire and, like, fractured her skull.
Yeah. And then she's like, but the real bad news is I'm failing chemistry.
Haha, right. It's a perfect example of how bad news can seem less severe when it's compared to something truly catastrophic.
Talk about putting things in perspective. So how does this contrast thing apply to, everyday life?
Well, let me ask you this. Have you ever noticed how, like, a cheaper bottle of wine can seem tastier after you've tried a really expensive one?
Now that you mention it.
That's contrast at work, my friend. It's a subtle but powerful way that our perceptions get influenced by those comparisons.
Okay, so I need to be on the lookout for those sneaky comparisons,
Yeah.
especially when I'm making big decisions. Got it.
Exactly. Don't let those sneaky comparisons cloud your judgment.
Okay, let's move on to commitment and consistency. This one seems like really ingrained in us, right? Once we take a stand, we tend to stick to it.
Oh, absolutely. We have this deep-seated desire to appear consistent, both to ourselves and to others. It's all about maintaining our self-image.
But those crafty toy manufacturers figured out how to use this against us, right?
Yeah.
By intentionally undersupplying stores with the hottest toy before Christmas.
Creating that artificial scarcity.
Yeah. And then, of course, parents end up promising their kids they'll get it later.
And then after Christmas, those ads start running again, and parents feel obligated to keep their promise.
Brilliant marketing, but also kind of evil.
Totally. And that's not even the, scary part. Remember what happened in those Korean War POW camps? The Chinese would get prisoners to write down, harmless statements.
And then they would, gradually escalate their requests.
Exactly. It's chilling. These small commitments created this, slippery slope of compliance.
So are we all just slaves to consistency then?
Well, not necessarily. The key is being aware of this tendency and questioning our motivations. Are we doing something because we genuinely want to? Or are we just trying to be consistent with a past decision, even if it's no longer serving us?
So sometimes it's okay to, change our minds.
Absolutely. We're allowed to evolve. It's crazy how just understanding these 6 principles really changes how you see the world. It's like you've been given this secret decoder ring for understanding how people think and act.
Yeah, right. It's like I keep catching myself noticing these tactics everywhere. We've been talking about how marketers and salespeople use them, but it makes you wonder, could we use these principles for good? To encourage people to be more eco-friendly, make more sustainable choices.
Absolutely. You're thinking about social proof, and you're spot on. Cialdini talks about how we can use that principle to, nudge people towards positive behaviors. Imagine if instead of always hearing about, all the terrible things happening with climate change, we were bombarded with messages about all the people who are already taking action.
So instead of focusing on the negative, the doom and gloom, we highlight all the positive stuff that people are already doing. It's like, hey, look, all these cool people are doing it. You should too.
Precisely. We're social creatures, right? We want to fit in. So if we see that people like us are making sustainable choices, we're way more likely to do the same. And Cialdini found that, highlighting what others are already doing is way more effective than just preaching about what people should be doing.
Makes sense to me. It's not about guilt-tripping people. It's about creating a sense of, community, a sense of positive momentum. Speaking of community, though, what about liking? It seems like we could use that principle to, build bridges between people who disagree, maybe even help them understand each other's viewpoints.
You're hitting on something really important there. We know that we're more likely to listen to people we like, even if we don't agree with them. And one of the biggest things that makes us like someone is, if we think they're similar to us.
So if I can find something in common with someone, even if it's just a small thing, I'm more likely to actually hear what they have to say.
Exactly. It's it doesn't even have to be this big, important thing. It could be liking the same music, sharing a hobby, or even just having the same sense of humor. Cialdini even talks about this thing where, negotiators try to find some small point of agreement at the beginning of a discussion.
Why do they do that?
It creates a sense of, hey, we're in this together, and that can make it much easier to actually work together and find a solution.
That's so interesting. It really shows you how even these tiny little things can actually make a huge difference when it comes to, connecting with other people. Now, I do want to circle back to commitment and consistency for a sec. We talked earlier about how this principle can be used unethically, like those toy manufacturers creating that artificial scarcity. But how can we use it for, good?
Well, think about, like, New Year's resolutions. People who write those down and share them with their friends or family are way more likely to actually follow through.
Why is that?
Because they've made a public commitment, and that desire to be consistent kicks in and helps them stay on track. So it's not about tricking people, right? It's about using that principle to support positive change.
I like that.
And you know what's even more interesting? This principle can actually be helpful in resolving conflicts too.
Really? Tell me more about that.
Like, if you can get someone to commit to even a tiny little concession, it can make them much more open to compromising on other things later on. It's kind of like that foot in the door technique, you know?
Oh, yeah. Start small and gradually work your way up to the bigger stuff.
Exactly. It's about finding that first little agreement, that first step that can set things in motion. Now, earlier we talked about authority and how it can sometimes lead to blind obedience, and that can obviously have really bad consequences.
I'm still kind of reeling from those Milgram experiments.
Yep.
I mean, the fact that regular people were willing to inflict pain on others just because a guy in a lab coat told them to, it's terrifying.
It is disturbing. It really is. And it just goes to show you how important it is to be critical thinkers and not just blindly follow orders and, to be willing to question authority, especially when things don't feel right.
But isn't there a time and place for obedience, though? Like, if a firefighter is telling me to get out of a burning building, I'm not going to stop and question their authority.
Of course not. There are definitely times when obedience is, crucial. But we also have to be aware of those situations where authority might be misused or where someone might be pretending to be an authority figure for their own selfish reasons.
So how do we know when to trust authority and when to be suspicious?
That's a tough question. But one good rule of thumb is trust your gut. If something feels off, if something doesn't seem right, listen to that little voice in your head.
So don't be afraid to ask questions, even if it's someone in a position of authority.
Exactly. If they're legit, they won't mind. In fact, they'll probably appreciate it. Okay, before we wrap this up, I do want to touch on contrast one more time. I'm really curious about how we can use this principle to help people make healthier choices.
Oh, yeah, good point. Like, I've noticed that a lot of messages about healthy eating focus on all the stuff you have to give up. No sugar, no carbs, no fun. But what if we use contrast to flip that script?
Love it. What if we focused on all the amazing things you gain when you start eating healthier?
Yeah. Like, imagine a campaign that talks about how much energy you have or how much clearer your mind feels when you ditch the processed food.
Exactly. Or, how much more delicious and flavorful fresh fruits and veggies are compared to, like, a greasy fast food burger.
So we're not lying or anything. We're just changing the focus, highlighting all the good stuff that comes with a healthy lifestyle.
Precisely. And you know what? This approach could even work with exercise.
Really?
Instead of focusing on, like, the pain in the sweat, what if we talked about that feeling of accomplishment after a good workout? Or how awesome that endorphin rush is?
So it's all about connecting those positive feelings with healthy behaviors.
Exactly. And I think it could make a real difference. Okay, so we've explored how these principles can be used for good and bad. But there's one thing that's still kind of bugging me, this whole issue of manipulation. How do we know where persuasion ends and manipulation begins? Where's the line?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It can be really hard to tell sometimes.
It can, but I think the key difference comes down to intention.
Okay, so if someone is using these principles to, like, trick or exploit other people, that's manipulation.
Exactly. Manipulation is all about getting what you want, regardless of the other person's well-being. But ethical persuasion is about, using these principles to help both people involved. It's about finding solutions that work for everyone.
So it's about being honest with people, being upfront about your goals, and respecting their right to make their own decisions.
Exactly. It's about creating a space where both people feel heard, respected, and, empowered. Now, we spent a lot of time talking about how these principles can be used to influence other people, but what about using them ourselves? Like to break bad habits or achieve personal goals?
Oh, that's interesting. Can we actually do that?
Absolutely. Like, let's say you're trying to stop procrastinating.
Ugh, don't even get me started.
We've all been there. But instead of just, like, beating yourself up about it, try using commitment and consistency to your advantage. Make a public declaration about your goal, maybe even write it down and stick it on your fridge.
So I'm like using that desire to be consistent to help me stay motivated.
Exactly. And you can even use social proof by, hanging out with people who are already doing what you want to do.
Oh, right. Like if I want to be more productive, I should spend more time with productive people. It's like that saying, you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with.
Exactly. Who you surround yourself with really matters. And, you know what else? You can even use scarcity on yourself.
Wait, how do you do that? Use scarcity on yourself.
Okay, so let's say you're trying to get into the habit of exercising more regularly. Instead of telling yourself, I have to exercise every single day, which can feel kind of overwhelming, try setting yourself a limited time challenge.
Okay, like what?
Like, tell yourself, I'm going to exercise for 30 minutes every day for the next 30 days.
So I'm creating a sense of urgency, like this opportunity is going to disappear if I don't act now.
Exactly. It's about tapping into that psychological principle we talked about earlier, reactance. We're just more motivated by things that feel like they're slipping away from us.
That's so cool. So it's not just about like other people using these principles on us. We can actually use them to help ourselves grow and achieve our goals.
Right. And the best part is when we're using these principles on ourselves, we're doing it from a place of self-love and empowerment. We're not trying to trick or manipulate ourselves. We're using these tools to help us become better versions of ourselves.
That's a really great point. It reminds us that these principles, while they can be used in negative ways, are actually neutral tools. It all depends on how we choose to use them.
Absolutely. It all comes down to intention. Are we using these principles to help ourselves and the people around us? Or are we using them for selfish or even harmful reasons?
That's a question worth asking ourselves, for sure. Okay, before we wrap this up, there's one more thing that I wanted to bring up. Cialdini talks about the power of click, whir,
Yeah.
and how those automatic responses can lead to this kind of like mindless conformity.
Yeah, like we're just going through the motions without really stopping to think about what we're doing or why we're doing it.
But aren't there times when conformity is actually a good thing? Like following traffic laws or, basic social etiquette?
Oh, for sure. I mean, conformity is essential for keeping society functioning smoothly. Imagine if everyone just did whatever they wanted all the time. It would be chaos.
Right. So how do we find that balance then? How do we know when to conform and when to, be our own person and think for ourselves?
That's a really important question. I think it starts with awareness, being able to recognize those situations where conformity is, necessary for the greater good. And also the situations where it might be holding us back from being creative or innovative or even just, being true to ourselves.
So it's about paying attention to the context, being aware of the potential consequences of our actions, both for ourselves and for the people around us.
Exactly. And it's about being brave enough to step outside of that comfort zone of conformity when we need to speak up for what we believe in or to challenge the status quo or even just to, be ourselves.
That could be scary, though,
Yeah,
especially when everyone else is doing something different.
it can be. But it can also be incredibly empowering to know that we have the power to choose, to think for ourselves, to break free from that herd mentality.
And sometimes, that one person who dares to be different, who stands up for what they believe in, can inspire others to do the same.
It's true. It's like that ripple effect. One person's courage can set off this chain reaction of positive change.
I love that. So while conformity can be powerful, it's important to remember that we always have a choice. We can choose to go along with the crowd, or we can choose to forge our own path.
And sometimes forging our own path is exactly what the world needs.
Okay, I think we've covered just about everything in this deep dive.
We've explored Cialdini's 6 principles of persuasion, talked about how they can be used for both good and bad, and even discussed how we can use them on ourselves to achieve our goals.
Phew, it's been a wild ride.
It has, but I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
I know, right? There's so much more to learn.
There always is.
Well, for our listener, we're about to wrap things up with some final thoughts on Cialdini's work and what it all means for, navigating this crazy world we live in.
It's a lot to think about, right?
It is, but it's also, like, empowering in a way.
I think so, too.
Like, now we know what to look out for. We can't be tricked as easily.
Haha, exactly. Well, hopefully.
Okay, so for our listener, who's now armed with all this knowledge about persuasion, what would you say is the most important thing to remember, the big takeaway?
If I had to pick just one thing, it would be awareness. just being aware of these principles, how they work, that makes us so much less susceptible to being influenced without realizing it.
Right. So it's not about, like, being suspicious of everyone or thinking everyone's out to get us.
No, not at all. It's more about just approaching things with, like, a healthy dose of skepticism.
Questioning everything.
Not everything, but, not just taking things at face value and thinking critically about the information we're being given, and also, like, really being intentional about the decisions we make.
Making sure they align with, like, our values.
Exactly.
It's like Cialdini has given us this, like, secret decoder ring for understanding the world around us.
He has. He really has.
Like, now we can see all these subtle forces that are, like, constantly trying to shape our thoughts and our actions.
And, once you see them, you can't unsee them.
Exactly. But the cool thing is, once we're aware of them, we have a choice.
We have the power.
We do. We're not just, like, mindless robots responding to these triggers.
They're not puppets.
Exactly. So, as Cialdini says, influence is everywhere.
It is.
But now, so is our awareness.
Yeah.
So keep your eyes open, everyone, your mind sharp, and trust your gut.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, that's about it for this deep dive into the psychology of persuasion. Thanks for listening.